Pandemic diseases. Why do we never learn?
Hello, and welcome to the Mark and Pete Show. Well, coronavirus continues to spread chaos throughout the world. But coronavirus is not the first time that the world has experienced a pandemic. If we think about over the years, cholera, bubonic plague, smallpox, and influenza are just some of the most brutal killers in human history. And these outbreaks of these diseases across international borders are, without any doubt, defining as pandemic crisis. But let's pick out some of the things that maybe we should learn from history. And are we really turning to the right sources? Are governments prepared? Are we all prepared? Now, I'm going to quote somebody who actually forecasts some issues that could actually sort of befall us. Now, here's an individual that had a bit of a vision. Yes, it was Bill Gates. Why would you think? Well, I'll give you an example. So back in 2015, he was talking about Ebola on a TED Talk. And this is what he had to say. He said, "What I've learned is very sobering. As awful as this pandemic has been, the next one could be much worse. The world is simply not prepared to deal with a disease, and especially a virulent flu, for example. The infects a number of people, very, very quickly. And all of the things that could kill 10 million people or more, by far the most likely is an epidemic." Now, was he really right? Was the world actually prepared? Well, with me today is Clergyman Pete. Now, Clergyman Pete, we're going to go through what we believe are our highlights of the most damaging pandemics or epidemics, if we wish, that actually has affected the world. But let me start with this big question. Why is it we never seem to be prepared for a pandemic?
Yeah, well, I believe that the reason we never seem to be prepared is just a simple case of inertia. Once you start living in a certain way, the pandemic, there hasn't been a pandemic or a serious problem like that for some time, we end up not being prepared. The next time there is a pandemic, we panic. You could liken it to a war-type situation. Between wars, there's a tendency to, as time goes by, spend less and less on the military. They take their equipment's out of date, etc., etc. At the start of the Second World War, that was the case with the United Kingdom. And for these pandemics, keeping preparedness is very difficult because it's so expensive. It's difficult politically. That's what I'm saying, and so that's my take on it. So I don't know what you think. I mean, that's it's a simple case of human nature and politics. That if you want to get re-elected, you want to spend money. So you don't want to spend money on something that might not happen.
But I think one of the things that we've noticed, and in fact, actually, we're going to go through some of these listeners in a bit more detail. But one of the things that's notable is that people are not learning the lesson even in the last 20 years, because there have been outbreaks on different levels that have affected individual countries, i.e. it's an epidemic. An epidemic basically meaning that it's effectively affected a particular region, whereas what we are now experiencing with the coronavirus, the COVID-19, is a pandemic. It's gone around the world, and this has obviously, sadly, affected many, many people, and we've had fatalities. The trouble is that surely the big question has to be for many, many political leaders and people in society is the call for what we might call a disaster recovery, a lockdown, something that basically helps people to react. Now, I understand what you're saying. Yes. I understand that. Well, where do you put the money? Because we're in a times when money can be short, and that's not great. But surely, when lives are at risk, we now need to learn these lessons. Otherwise, more and more people will sadly die.
Well, I agree. I mean, if we look back in history, we can see. I mean, we should be able to learn lessons for how these diseases.
I think you have one particular favourite to start.
Well, Talking off air, we were looking back through these great pandemics in history, and we can go back in history because, of course, they had a huge effect. So there's a lot of information kept about them, and we should be able to analyse them. Now, my favourite, well, it's a bit, calling it a favourite is a bit like having your favourite villain or something, because these a pandemic in the history of the world is a bad guy. So I guess it's sort of the most effective, the most terrible, the most horrific of them. Now, there's quite a few, but the one that I've selected of the pandemic. So we're specific looking at pandemics at the moment. Ones that go countries, many different countries, maybe across the world. The flu pandemic of 1968, known as the Hong Kong flu. Now, in fact, these particular diseases always have, strangely, slightly amusing names, or ones that trip off the tongue, as though they're something
but
friendly.
Not amusing for the victim.
No, I mean, it's almost as though there's something in the human psyche that we have to try and take it down a peg or two by giving it so the Hong Kong flu. Well, Hong Kong flu, you could have called it that, but why not call it, that is what it is. Why not call it the Hong Kong influenza? You call it Hong Kong flu because of the sound of it. Now, this pandemic back in '68 was caused by a change in a particular influenza virus, the influenza A virus, and it had a genetic offshoot causing the H3N2 strain, which was was an offshoot from the H2N2. And on the July the 13th, 1968, in Hong Kong, the first case was reported. Only 17 days later, there were outbreaks of the virus in Singapore and Vietnam. So that's quick. And then within 3 months, it had gone to the Philippines, India, Australia, Europe, and the United States. That's why I'm talking about this particular one. It was very fast and widespread at the same time. But it had a very low mortality rate. But here's the point. Having a low mortality rate, in fact, having in many people only mild symptoms, means that people travel with it. And that made it more deadly. And in fact, it resulted in the deaths of over 1 million people, happening pretty quickly. In Hong Kong, there were 500,000 deaths. That's 15% of its population at the time.
Yes.
So that's my in inverted commas favourite, the flu pandemic of 1968, the Hong Kong flu. It was fast and widespread very quickly, and it killed more people by having a sort of softly approach. If we sort of attribute sort of motives to just a virus, but it was effective because for most people it wasn't deadly. In fact, it produced mild symptoms, so they spread out and spread it. That's why. What about you? What one would you choose?
I'm going to give you mine, but before we do, I just want to learn some lessons, because that's the whole point of this.
Oh, sure.
Which is the one point behind this is that I gather that clearly, as you said, is the fact that there is no lockdown. The fact that some people can travel. Now, this is surely where a lot of people will reflect even on the current situation, which is why did governments not lock down their borders quick enough?
Yes.
Now, if they had if
they had done that, and they also need to be ready to do that, so there needs to be a written, agreed protocol. That's
correct.
That's why it's not done, because it's a difficult decision to make. Anyway, carry on.
Well, it is a difficult decision to make, but I think this is about the point of learning from the lessons, because the Hong Kong flu, as you mentioned, is not really that long ago. To be fair, I know some of our listeners may not be as old, but nevertheless, there will be some listeners
who were around at that time. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, again, that's another pointer. We are going to highlight a number of other ones, but you see, this comes back to, again, strong recommendations, which is that actually there should be, and this is maybe where the World Health Organization actually gives strong recommendation, that if there is some outbreak of an issue, such as a disease, as you've described, or in any other for
Yes,
that
yeah,
matter,
yeah,
is
yeah.
having a procedure. There doesn't seem to be a procedure globally. Now,
Well,
some countries say, yes, but they've got a procedure, but not a
yeah, no,
global
no.
procedure.
For these, so it needs to be global. It needs to be something
Yes.
like. I mean, the illustration I would use is if you're doing something dangerous. If they've got something
Yeah.
dangerous, like flying an aircraft, you have a checklist, and and then have a checklist for when
Yeah.
there's a disaster. So if the aeroplane is going to go down, you have a checklist to go through, because in that situation you need to act quickly,
Yeah.
not make mistakes, and you don't want to have to make decisions. So the decision's already made because there's a list of what to do, and that's really what we as Mark and Pete. This is
Yes.
Mark and Pete's show recommendation. Is that what you should? That's what you should do. You should have effectively a checklist for what to do in the different types of pandemic.
Yes.
So the decision has already been made. All you have to do is action it.
And interestingly, I'm going to take it on a different level, but it is
Yeah.
important because it's a contributor, which is for business. So I'll take it from a business perspective, which is
Sure.
having a risk strategy. All businesses have a risk strategy, but I bet none of them have really considered the health strategy as part of risk. And maybe, what we're experiencing with COVID-19 will change people's minds. Now, I'm going to turn to
Yes. What's your favourite?
a particular, shall we say, villain that is perhaps a little bit older, and you'll
Oh, yeah.
get a sense of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, going
But
for the
probably
classics. Yeah.
going for the classics. But I'm before I actually reveal what it is, I'm going to give you a clue. But this is in the form of a poem.
Okay. Go ahead.
Luella the flea lived happily, flitting about from you to me. She lived in mats and other habitats, but felt more at home on large cowpats. The flying flea flew far and free, and spread disease with much glee, though Fluella knew when day she blew, how mysteriously she caught the flu. A flea with flu, oh, what to do? For as she fretted, the crisis grew. Fluella did sneeze and hit the breeze, whizzing around the blossom trees, with a head full of cold and great pain untold. Her bugged movements became uncontrolled. The flea flew flat and then went splat as she fell upon a fleeing rat. The rat, called Craig, looked shocked and vague, then began to scuttle and spread the plague. As the flea did flee, folk died in mystery, and Fluella was consigned to horrible history. Yes, I wonder which one you
Horrible
could think
histories.
it is. Well, yes, indeed, it's the Black Death, and this was between 1346 to 1353. Have a guess at the death toll of that particular bubonic plague. So have a guess how many million
Okay.
died on
Now
that one.
this is. I know. You see, just
It's a
thinking out
big
loud.
number, but what I will say is that they can never quantify it exactly, but it gives you a guide of the sheer
Okay.
ferocity
Well, I
of
know
this.
that it was a large proportion of the people in
Yes.
Europe, but I also know it was a long time ago, so there weren't as many people in Europe. I'm going to say 50 million.
Well, actually, it was even at the lowest estimate was between 75 million to 200 million people. So here's a bit of a background to it. So the outbreak of the plague ravaged Europe, Africa, and Asia, with an estimated death toll, as I mentioned. Now, this was thought to have originated in Asia. The plague most likely jumped continents via the fleas, Floella the flea, on rats that frequently lived aboard merchant ships. So what we're seeing here is, folks, do you remember? Travel, yes? Yeah. Ports, being major urban centres at the time, were the perfect breeding ground for the rats and the fleas, and thus the insidious bacterium flourished, devastating 3 continents in its wake. Here's a lesson from history. We did not have lockdown. Now, of course, obviously with something like that, society was very different in the 14th century, but nevertheless, there are many other examples where when there is an outbreak, people just carried on trading and carried on traveling and carried on their business. There was no policy. And surely this is a game we could pick many other ones. So, Clergyman Pete, I mean, are there other notable outbreaks of pandemics that you'd like to? I've got a few of my own that I'd like to
Well, I'm
call
afraid
upon.
I'm going to
They're
have
not that
to.
long ago.
No, I'm going to pick. I don't know whether you pick this one, of course, business from Mark, but the one that I'm going to pick is one that people might remember. Which is HIV, which of course, gives you AIDS. Now this, I wanted to highlight because of it's different to the one we've just been talking about. The ones we've just been talking about, in the way it is transmitted, it's quite difficult to catch. You've almost got to go out of your way to catch it. People did catch it by accident, sometimes because they're medics, and so they're putting themselves in harm's way. But it shouldn't have been a pandemic if people just lived normal moral lives. So that was the strange feature of it, that it had almost like a moral overtone to it, which paradoxically then made it more difficult because you said, well, I don't want to be prejudiced against people. The ways that it spread were by injecting yourself with shared needles. So if you were that way inclined to inject yourself, but also homosexuals spread it because in the way that they engage in sexual activity results in bleeding.
Yeah,
and that's why the two problems, those two features, it made it difficult to get people to get it under control. Whereas you would have thought that would be quite simple if people had any self-control, but they needed to change a whole lifestyles to change it. And currently, 5% of the population of sub-Saharan Africa is still infected. Yes. Look, this is a really bad disease, and so that's an interesting feature of it. Now, I noticed, you will note if you're around at its peak, that there's so much in terms of education was needed, and this was really changed the whole culture, that you could suddenly talk about things that you couldn't talk about before. So that's why I'm highlighting that one. It was different to the others, and one of the main features was it needed a bigger change in lifestyle than, for example, needing to wash your hands more often. It was a bigger change.
Mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to pick one which basically I'll give you the time period and see whether you can pick it out. It was 1852 to 1860. I'm going to tell you as well that it affected not just the parts of Europe, particularly Great Britain, but it also similar issues occurred in places in Asia.
Now, what could it? Where was it? Where was it particularly? Where was the biggest outbreak? Would you say?
In
is that
Europe,
going to give it away?
I'm going to give it away, but I might as well. Let's get it moving.
Well, I think that
London.
Think that it's cholera.
I think it's cholera.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, now here's the thing, because what actually happened is that the most deadly of the 7 cholera pandemics, apparently there have been many. This, what I'm referring to, was the 3rd major outbreak. But basically, it took place, as you could see, over an 8-year period. But what happened is that there was the spreading from the Ganges River Delta before it ripped through Asia and Europe. But the critical thing is that, interestingly, John Snow was the physician who, while working in a poor area of London, tackled cases of cholera and eventually succeeded in identifying contaminated water, which was the means of the transmitted disease. Now, unfortunately, that meant that over 23,000 people had died in Great Britain. But nevertheless, the point there is that getting to the source was the key. And doing something about it, effectively switching off the pumps, as they had to do at the time. So once he realized where the contamination happened, clearly that was never going to continue. So the point here is, albeit it's a different disease, it's a different situation, action was taken. But I do come back to this point that we've been mentioning, which is what really should people actually do? What is actually the best practice? I think what we're going to see now, and dare I say, this global world that we're now living in, globalization, in my opinion, is not going to go away. I know that we're all in lockdown mode. People are not traveling, and quite rightly so. Stay at home, folks. Do not travel. Yes, exactly. And stay in isolation, especially if you've got a problem. But what I would say here is that let's be positive. Things are going to obviously improve, get back to normality. But I do believe that countries need to actually think about a risk strategy, particularly to prevent any epidemics and then eventually pandemics. So, Clergyman Pete, before we sort of conclude, because I've got some guidance from Mr. Gates, who gave some advice during his TED Talk 5 years ago. But before we come on to that,
Yes.
what's your take on what people should do and where they should learn their lessons?
Well, I'm going to give what may be a bit of unpopular advice. I mean, this is not advice to individuals, this is advice to countries. And that is, keep your borders. Being able to control borders is very, very important. And one of the contributing factors to fast spread of the current problem with a pandemic is open borders, people travelling around without checks on them. And if we had stricter controls and were able to tighten up our borders quickly, you wouldn't need, for example, a president of the United States to step in. Too late, but that's not his fault to stop travel from certain areas. So, nation states are the best way to run things in the world, with close cooperation between them, but have nation states with controlled borders so they know what's happening when they go across them. That would be my first bit of advice. And the second thing, it would be to say, to keep up the education level about these different diseases. You know, we're just going through a few. It'd be interesting to know from the listeners, did you know about them? Did you know about these diseases? Because we could easily learn from them that what we could learn is we need to change our lifestyles often to cope with the disease. So we've got to be prepared to do that. If the stories were told and retold about how people changed what they did, they didn't use the water pumps. They used protection during sexual intercourse. They washed their hands when they were going into a building or out of a building to make sure they weren't taking the disease. It depends on the different disease what it is, but you need to be prepared to change your lifestyle. And lastly, we need to know about it. So governments, like for example the Chinese government with the current pandemic, doesn't seem to have passed on information quickly enough. There needs to be strict retribution for any government that doesn't pass on information. Otherwise, it's going to happen again. So those are my three main takeaways.
Yep. Yeah. Well, indeed. Now, listeners, I referenced
Bill say?
well, indeed, as a conclusion to Bill's TED Talk 5 years ago. And remember, you got to point this out, that the world was a very different place, but his words resonate. And what he said as he was speaking, I believe we can prevent such a catastrophe. He was talking about Ebola at the time, by building a global warning and response system for epidemics. It would apply the kind of planning that goes into national defense, systems for recruiting, training and equipping health workers, investments in new tools, etc., to the effort to prevent and contain outbreaks. Well, that is remarkable, isn't it? And how people still are not learning their lessons. Well, Bill, we certainly agree with you on that point. Listeners, what do you think? Do you have a view on what governments should do? Why not log on to markandpete.com and let us know your thoughts? Well, to stay safe, follow the advice, and stay isolated. Toodle pip.